Hi everybody, when it comes to making sure things on the canvas look really sharp and crisp, making sure our DPI awareness code is there to make sure that on retina displays or other high resolution screens that everything looks good is only one part of the solution. The other part is taking into account how the canvas deals with all the various things we can draw, and oftentimes we need a special case to behavior depending on what it is we're doing. So one example is lines. When we were drawing the grid earlier where we have horizontal lines and vertical lines, we added the DPI aware code to make sure things look pretty sharp, but there was another subtle detail that only applies to lines that I added in this example that we're going to dive into in this particular video, which is how do you make sure lines can be made to look sharp independent of just adding the DPI aware code, because the conventional wisdom is this. When we're working with lines, we want to ensure our lines are positioned on integer values, whole numbers, to make sure everything looks sharp and crisp and not blurry. Now, as it turns out though, you're going to find out in a moment, that isn't always the case. Because there are two rules here, and the two rules are this. When we're drawing lines, if our lines have an odd width or an odd thickness, for example, they're 1 pixel wide or 3 pixel wide, we need to position the line on a half pixel coordinate. And for even width lines that have an even width or an even thickness, for example, a 2 pixel line or a 4 pixel line, those lines should be positioned on whole pixel coordinates. Now, keep that in mind. It sounds a little bizarre, so let's look at an example very quickly. So what I have here is I'm in IDX, my favorite coder of choice. Just so happens I also work on the team that builds this, so minor conflict of interest there. Ignoring that, I have an example here where I have my canvas and there's really nothing too fancy going on. I just have some CSS to make sure a canvas is visible, otherwise it's just going to be an empty region. It has a width of 600, height of 300, ID value of my canvas, and then I have some boilerplate JavaScript to just get the canvas element in the DOM and also have a reference to the context object. So let me look at my notes very quickly. Yep. So what I'm going to do first is just draw a line. I'm going to draw a 1 pixel line here, and I'm going to first set stroke style. Let's make it a blue color. I'm going to use the key, the color value blue, the word blue, not anything else. Let's do a line width, and let's keep things simple and just do line width of 1. The autocomplete kind of did a lot of work for me, so I'm gonna trust that for now. It is begin path move to, and I want this line to be horizontal, and so it's going to be starting at the 150 mark in the middle, and it's going to have an X position of 50, and it's going to end at the 550 mark and go to 150. I'm going to hit refresh, and you can see the line that's being displayed right now. Now, what you're seeing here is, depending on how you're watching this, it might look very sharp or it might look a little blurry, but the correct answer is this is supposed to be a blue line. It looks a little purplish because the line is kind of blurry. It is kind of blending in with the neighbors around it. And the reason is this, if you remember the rules, for a line width or thickness that is an odd value, 1, 3, 5, and so on, we need to position the main angle that our line is being drawn in on a half pixel value, which for a horizontal line, that's going to be the Y position. So the Y position is 150. Let's make it 150.5. We could also make it 149.5, entirely up to you on which one you prefer. But I made this change. Let me hit refresh to see what this looks like. Once I've refreshed, notice that the line looks blue right now, and it is not as fuzzy as it was before. It is actually sharp. And that's because when you're on a half pixel line for an odd sized width or thickness line, it's going to be right. And let's go the opposite of it, so the line number to an even value, say 4 pixels. If I just leave the values as is, where, for example, we're at the half pixel value and hit refresh, you can see that our blue line, it's a little blurry. The edges are not very sharp. That's because for an even value of line width or thickness, it needs to be integer or whole value. So I hit refresh, you can now see this looks pretty cool. And this whole thing also applies to lines that are drawn vertically as well. So all we do is just kind of swap the values around. So let's say in this case, I want the X value to be around the 300 mark on both directions. And the Y starts from, we'll start from like 50 and go to 250. And so in this case, the value is still an even sized width and thickness value. So we're going to keep it on an integer value. So 300, 300. hit refresh, looks pretty crisp. If I were to just make it a 50.5 to 50.5, you can see it looks blurry because, not supposed to be. But if I set it to an odd value like 3, you can see it looks blurry again, which is a little strange. It's because I'm setting the wrong value. It should be the 300.5, the axis of the line being drawn in. So now it looks pretty sharp. So before it looked blurry for the wrong reason. Now it's blurry now it's no longer blurry for the right reason. So always keep that in mind. Just because you put a half pixel value on the direction you're moving in is not right. It should be the line's actual origin itself. And that's really the crux of how to make sure when you're drawing lines, to make sure that you're special casing the position based on how thick the line is. Now, what we're going to do next is go a little bit deeper and talk about why that is the case. Why do we even have these bizarre rules? And before I get there though, if you'd like to learn more about the canvas, how to draw things on it, and to do animations and really take creative coding to a whole new level, my best-selling book, Canvas from Noob to Ninja, is great for you to check out. It makes a great gift. I have a description to how you can buy it in both physical form and in digital form in the description below. Now, getting back to our favorite line thickness issue where it's blurry on certain positions and sharp on others. The reason is this. Lines in the canvas, they're positioned along the center of their coordinates, not the edge. And because the lines have a thickness, they're filled up to the thickness in both directions. So if this is my line, the thickness goes up, the thickness goes below, and the total thickness is the value that I specified for it. If my hand gestures don't really help, here's a diagram that is probably a lot more clear. So I'm drawing a horizontal line. Let's say I have it at a position. Let's just say position foo. That's the Y position line you see right here. And let's say my line is 1 pixel in thickness. The way Canvas draws it, half of that 1 pixel goes up, half that other pixel goes down below the line that my canvas is going in, and cumulatively they are now going to be 1 pixel in width, but it grows outward from the middle in both directions. And the same thing applies to a vertical line where the X position line is where the position of my line starts, and then it expands in both directions until the sum of the expansion is the thickness or the width of the line that we are going for. And so let's imagine that we're drawing a horizontal line at a vertical position of 25 pixels, so Y equals 25. And when we look at this example, it'll kind of help you make it more clear why it's blurry in some cases and not in others. And so when we're drawing a 1 pixel width line at Y equals 25, the line starts at Y at 25 and expands by half a pixel above it and half a pixel below it, which is cumulatively, when you add those up, is 1 pixel. And if you look at the position value, that means our line goes from visually, from the top, it's at 24.5 pixels, and at the bottom, it goes to 25.5 pixels, with the center point being the starting point, which is 25. Now, because the line visually starts and ends at a half pixel value, that's where we get the blurriness from. And so the blurriness comes from the line not being on a whole value, but being on a half pixel value. And so when we shift the line to start from, let's say, 25.5 instead, so the center point is at 25.5, at this point, when our line visually goes up and below, that half pixel ends up on a whole value. So the top of the line is now at a 25 pixel mark, the bottom of the line is at a 26 pixel mark, and so it's on a full pixel value, which is why it looks very sharp. And that's the case for every odd thickness or odd width line that you'll ever be dealing with. Now when it comes to an even size line, let's say a 2 pixel width line, in this one, let's say it's centered at 25, great. And then because it's 2 pixels, it goes 1 pixel above, 1 pixel below, which means it ends at a 24, a whole value, and it starts at 24, a whole value, and ends at 26, another whole value. And for any even number, we will never get to a situation where dividing it by 2 to go, halfway up and halfway below or halfway left and right for a vertical line will end up with us being on a half pixel value. So that's why for any even valued thickness or stroke line, always start your positioning at a whole integer value. And in my article, which I have on the website on Crib.com, I have a much more detailed example where I walk through the various rendering comparisons across 4 examples of both even pixel width lines and odd pixel width lines. So you can see that in more detail. And the code for that is also provided. So just go to google.com and just type in drawing sharp lines on the canvas, or just go to krupp.com and search for this. Of course, the link to this is also going to be below, where I get a little more detail on some of the other edge cases that might be interesting for you to keep in mind. But while there are more edge cases that are in the article, there are two that I want to quickly bring up with you first. There are several ways to draw lines, especially perfectly vertical and horizontal ones. A very common one is to use a rectangle, because to us, a rectangle is 1 pixel in height, and however wide it is quite similar to a line that has a 1 pixel thickness or stroke width. Now, to us, they look similar, but to our canvas, they are two very different things. And the biggest difference is that lines, as we saw earlier, are drawn from their origin point and they go outward based on their thickness. Rectangles are not drawn center outward like lines are. They're pretty predictable because they always start from one axis and can go straight down. So the starting point you specify is actually the edge of the line, not the midpoint of the line. So the rectangles are much easier. So which means that whenever you and I are using rectangles to draw lines, we need to make sure that to position them on whole pixel values, always on whole pixel value, and make sure its size is also a whole pixel value. You don't want to set up like a rectangular height of 0.5 or 1.5 or 2.5 pixels, because that kind of defeats the purpose. Now, the last thing I also want to mention is everything I talked about right now only applies to lines that are horizontal or vertical. If the line has angled, like it's 45 degrees, 30 degrees, any arbitrary direction, you're going to get anti-aliasing by default, because the canvas is going to go, okay, point A, point B, no easy way to draw a straight line. So I'm going to blur the pixels between them to make it work. There are techniques we can use to disable anti-aliasing, but you may not want to disable anti-aliasing for your entire drawing. You may only want to disable it for just the line you're dealing with. And so one approach is a very popular one, a very traditional legacy graphics algorithm, one of the first ones of all time, is an approach developed by Jack Bresenham, the Bresenham line. And we'll look into that in the future of how to do this. And we even look at some other things about how to draw circles using the same Bresenham approach. So some really cool things to keep in mind there. But with that, we're done with this particular coverage of making sure lines are very sharp. I know this is an exciting topic, and I thank you for sticking around all the way to the end here. If you have any questions and you want to discuss more about lines, share your love for lines, go to krupp.com, forum.krupp.com, where on the forums where I and others would be happy to discuss all things web development related and other things as well, as you might want to have a community to chat with. And lastly, if you like this video, like, comment, and subscribe so your friends and enemies know all about it. Sign up for my newsletter to get updates on various tangential things to web development and business that I actually write about. Follow me at Kruppa on Twitter, or X, as the cool kids call it these days, for bite-sized updates on things that I'm sharing and reading and find interesting that you might find interesting as well. Lastly, check out my books. I have many books, not just on the canvas, but on topics like React, animation, data structures and algorithms, and a bunch of other topics that are just tickling my curiosity, so you might find them to be useful as well. Links to all of them below. And with that, I will see you all next time.